Yo, what's good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Gifted Hoops podcast. And today we're talking all things Atlanta Hawks. I'm joined here today by the host of the Locked On Hawks Network. Say hello to the people, Brad. He does great work for the Atlanta Hawks. Make sure to tap in. All of his links and all that will be in the description box below.
I appreciate you having me. It's good to be here and talk some basketball as always.
Yes, I'm very, very hyped for that. In terms of our show, you can find that on Spotify and Apple Podcasts at Gifted Hoops. Locked On Hawks is all over the place on YouTube as well. So all those links, again, will be in the description box below. Jalen Johnson is one of my favorite emerging young players in the league. I feel like last year he really left, a huge imprint on the game. He had many nights where he could make. He could actually play good defense. He could rebound the basketball. There's just a huge thing for his skill set. And I think with further development in that role, he can become a star player. I do believe that. And I think that trading for Julius Randle would kind of impact his overall development. I bring Jalen Johnson up because to me, this Hawks team is a very interesting team. I think for the past 3 to 4 years, they have been on an interesting timeline since they made the conference finals, with trading for DeJounte Murray and then trading him out. All in all, where do you think the future of the Hawks is going to go to? And what do you think last season told you about the current status of this team?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, not to go all the way back to what you said, the conference finals, like it sped them up a little bit. They already kind of tried to speed up a little bit faster. This like teams rebuild. And somebody usually at a top level, ownership level, something like that, gets a little bit overzealous and they want to speed up right now. They lose their patience, right? And the Hawks did that, and I honestly didn't like it, but then it kind of worked. They made the conference finals, and I'm not sure they were that good of a team, but they were playing at that level for about 3 months at that point in that season. It wasn't just the playoffs. That's been like memory hole for people that they made this run. They were playing really well the entire second half of the season. Yeah. And then they got, they beat the number 1 seed, all those things. But then that kind of locks you in. And that, at least that's what they did to the Hawks. They kind of, and they admitted this a year later, they kind of said, like, they kind of rested on their laurels a little bit. Like, all right, we made it. Here we are. They didn't really change the roster. And then after a little bit of a step back, you look up and they make a move that I think proved to not be the right one at this point to go out and get DeJounte. Now, the theory of it made sense, right? In some way. They thought that it was going to be a player who would do 2 things for them. He would help them to keep their offense afloat with Trae Young off the court, which they have never been able to do, and then also help them with their perimeter defense. He kind of did the first one. The second one, it did not happen. So long story short, that didn't work. They did it for 2 years. They gave it a full run. They didn't pull the plug too quickly. It was 2 full years, and we can avoid it if you want to, but like the numbers were like worse than people even realize nationally about how much it didn't work, especially this last year with Trae and DeJounte sharing the court together. So like, I think it's weird to say that, and it's not because DeJounte's not a good player. He's a good player. I want to be very clear about that. He's a very good player. It just, the fit didn't work in Atlanta. I think he's a point guard first and foremost. He couldn't be that in Atlanta. All these things. And then you look up, and I think this Hawks team might be better than it was last year. And not because it's not addition by subtraction. It's just the fit's a little bit better. But they're also not all in the way they were before. Like, you could argue what degree they were all in with DeJounte, but they had traded all of their future picks, not all of them, but a lot of them for DeJounte. And this is a different subject, but the Hawks famously don't spend. Like, they don't go into the tax. They just kind of have an avoidance of that. So it's tough to kind of do both, but they were kind of all in on that team. It obviously didn't work. They were in the play-in, yes, but it was a mid-30s, high-30s win team. And yeah, this year, could they lose more than they did last year? Yes, maybe. But I think I like them almost better than I did last year. And it's kind of a middling transition season looking ahead. Like, they're not tanking because they have no reason to tank because they don't have their own picks. It's kind of a reset on the fly. They still have their best player in Trae Young. I like Jalen just like you do. Like, he's the guy that I think I always say he's number 1 on their call sheet. Like, Trae Young is their best player, but their guy, I think in their mind right now, is Jalen. Jalen's like he's the guy in Atlanta in some ways because they're about to pay him on some level either this summer or next summer. And it's a pretty good team. It's not a great team. I think they probably know that, but it's kind of like, all right, let's figure out what we are now. Let's be responsible. Let's take the next step gradually. Now that we kind of can't rebuild the way that we maybe would have because they don't have their picks, and the DeJounte thing just didn't work, and they have to kind of reset now.
I like everything that you said. That was a great synopsis from the conference finals to where the current Hawks are. I'll give you my takes on it. I felt like the conference finals, we see this all the time, right? Teams see success and then they think, okay, this is our floor. This is what we are. Let's make things go faster. But growth isn't linear. Like every season doesn't trend as up and up and up and up and up. You're going to have your good days and your bad days and your good seasons and your bad seasons. And I feel like for the Hawks, they kind of had that coming to reality moment when they paid all their guys. And then a lot of them didn't perform at the same level as they were during that first initial season. Also, the head with that and Trae Young, like there were a lot of things going on with this Hawks team. And I feel like the DeJounte Murray trade, I said this at the time that happened. I said, I can understand the logic of thinking, okay, if we bring in another player to advantage create alongside Trae Young, it'll help. But I thought that the point of it was always going to be for the non-Trae Young minutes where, okay, we now have a guy who can really impact the game and kind of floor raise the offense when Trae Young is not in the game. And unfortunately, as you say, I mean, it didn't quite go the way the Hawks had hoped it would. DeJounte was okay when Trae Young wasn't on the floor, but at the end of the day, the offense ran the best when it was Trae Young without DeJounte Murray. I have the numbers in front of me here. When Trae Young and DeJounte Murray were on the floor together last season, the Hawks had a minus 6.3 differential, negative. But then when you have Trae Young on the floor and you have Murray out, their offense produced 122.2 points per possession. So it shows you that the offense was a bit wonky. And I kind of said this too. Like, I like DeJounte Murray. I think he's a good player. There's good things that he does. But I feel like the fit with Trae Young was questionable because to me, both of them are best when the ball's in their hands. And when it's not, you're having to try to make them work. And it kind of feel like they just took turns and tried to like overpass to not step on toes. And that just made the offense not great. I remember stretches where Trae Young was hurt and you saw DeJounte Murray playing at a very high level. You saw the same thing for Trae. I just feel like if you can't have a star player maximize your other star player, that's not a winning formula. So they tried the experiment and it failed. But I think there's a lot of things that they learned from that. I agree with you, right? I think the Hawks might be better than last year as well because addition from subtraction to me, but more importantly, everything gets simpler. Trae Young, the ball is going to be in your hands a lot more. Jalen Johnson, you're going to get even more reps to build on your great breakout year from last year. And the offense should look a lot better. I'm not quite sure how the number one pick is going to fit into all these because he's very, very young. But I'm interested in at least to say what the Hawks could be moving forward. It definitely is something that's very, 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 very fascinating. I did kind of want to ask you this question too. Like, Trae Young to me is a very good player. The fit of his game and where that timeline matches with Atlanta is a question I have. Do you think Trae Young is still the right fit for this team? Or do you think the Hawks need to also trade him as well? I'm not quite sure where you stand on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that if anything, Trae is probably undervalued now around the league. And I don't say that to say he's, the top 10 player or anything like that. He's not. I don't think that Trae Young is a top 10 player. I think Trae Young is very good. It went from, Trae Young, when they went to the conference finals, got love, and he should have. He was the best player on the conference finals team, and that's an accomplishment that a lot of guys never get to.
Yep.
And I think since then, I think Trae's kind of the same guy, and that's not a knock. I don't mean that in a negative way. I think Trae is still the same player he was then, but now he's not thought of that way anymore. And a lot of that's supporting, a lot of that's what you just, you gave the numbers about how him and DeJounte didn't work. And this, like, the best player is going to get blame when a team underperforms. That's what happens. And Trae could have been better. I'm not saying he was perfect the last 2 years. He wasn't. But like if you look at his numbers, you look at his individual on-court impact, the advanced stats, he still looks like a great player by the numbers and all those things. And watching him every game, every minute of his career, honestly, like, he's got flaws. Like, it's interesting now to look back. The same questions about Trae Young as a franchise building block have been there since day one. It was always going to be not impossible, hard to build a title contender around Trae Young, because he, the history of the league, for one, how many title contenders have been built around a 6'1" guard in our lifetimes? The answer is basically zero. Like, Steph Curry's not 6'1", and Steph is the smallest guy that's been the best player on a title team, basically. And I wish you want to count Tony Parker, maybe, but they had Tim Duncan, who was old by then. All those things. So, and that's obviously anecdotal, but it's just hard to build around a small guard. Like, he's a bad defender, yes. Is he as bad as people think that he is? Probably not, because there's this caricature of Trae Young, the defender, that's like he's not even standing there. He's not that bad, but he's bad. You have to build around that. You have to build around a guy who has the ball in his hands a lot, and he's got to have to do a lot. I get it. There are concerns there, but there are 30 teams in the league, and only how many of them, 6 or 7 of them, have a guy that everybody's comfortable with being the number one option on the team. You know what I mean? Like, some teams have to have flawed number one options, and I think the Hawks have that with Trae Young. Long preamble, but the last few months is the first time since he got to Atlanta where it's been like legitimately possible that they were to look to move on from him. We're in a spot now where I'm not going to tell you that the Hawks are going to hang up the phone instantly when you call about Trae Young. If you call about Trae Young 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there's no conversation there. He's off the market. He's untouchable. We all understand that. But when you add 2 or 3 years of mediocre play for the team, not for him, but for the team, a regime change, a new front office, new head coach, they're not as married to him as they once were. At the same time, he's still their best player by a lot. And you don't just give that guy away. And there's this whole secondary ankle we don't have to do if you don't want to, about like the city of Atlanta and how they haven't had a superstar as big of a name as Trae Young.
A good point.
Since Dominique Wilkins. Like, this does matter.
Yeah.
You could debate that, how much it matters. I'm not saying that's the reason why you can't trade him, but there are local cultural factors too, like where he's a big marquee name on a team that didn't have that for a long, long time. So I said it earlier, Jalen Johnson, I think is like the guy for this front office, and this, like, they love Jalen Johnson, but you don't just move on from Trae Young willy-nilly. Like, you got to be pretty sure what you're going to do. And I do think this year, though, this will probably be a theme of the whole conversation. It's a learning year for a lot of the team, a lot of the front office. And if you look about a year from now, and Trae, either Trae is not happy, or the team's not happy, or they're both not happy, they could part ways a year from now. That would not surprise me at all, because looming is a contract extension. Like, he's gonna have to come. Like, he'll be a free agent in 2 years.
Yep.
There's that whole a year from now is like D-Day of what you have to decide for Trae Young. Is he your guy or not? And the answer is TBD, because if this season goes well, I think I bake on him signing extension, being around long-term, etc. Kumbaya. If it doesn't go that well, or if it's just like, let's move on, they'll try to trade him and see what they can get.
I think the problem with the Trae Young discourse is what you just highlighted, right? Trae Young really isn't that different of a player from what he was before. If anything, he's still one of the most elite playmakers this league has seen. I mean, his proficiency in the pick and roll, Trae Young basically on the floor is a walking top 10 offense, right? Like that's the high level impact we see from him. The problem with Trae Young, for me at least, is beyond that, with him being size, I would say, challenged, right? You need to see him be able to adjust off the ball. And it's such an interesting conversation, because people often say, well, Trae Young doesn't do much off the ball. Well, yeah, because he's on the ball and he's a very good ball dominant guard. That's fine. I'm not asking him to run Golden State Warriors offense or schemes, but just be more effective. Like, it boggles me to this day. And I pray to God, right? Brad, I pray to God. I pray the Hawks think, okay, listen, we have Jalen Johnson. He can make inverted pick and rolls. Use Trae Young as a screener option. Let him run off the ball, because my biggest thing with Trae is a lot of people have soured on him, in my opinion, because his starts to the season for 2 back-to-back seasons now have been a bit rough, where his true shooting on volume hasn't really been as good. But then in the middle of the season, he really picks it back up, and okay, bam, that is the Trae Young. Because people compared him coming in to Steph Curry, which I said yes, Brad, yes. I said at the beginning, can we pump the brakes on that? Trae Young, to me, is a more proficient playmaker than Steph. Steph is like the efficiency god in terms of, you know, threes, true shoot. Like, right, like there's differences to that. I don't think Trae Young has reached that level of overall efficiency yet. But as a creator, he's in like his own type of, you know, thing. Like it's Ja, Trae Young, and Luka. Those are like the three best like on-ball creators. Also Dame in there too, just from the guard spot, right? So for me, Atlanta, I really implore that they find a way to make him more impactful in those areas, because he takes very difficult shots, and a lot of it is because he's on the ball having to do so much. I feel like if you just made his life a bit easier, he could be even more efficient. And it's crazy because if he was just slightly more of that, they'd be like, oh, Trae's a really good player. No, he still is a good player. It's just his role could be expanded in so many different ways, I feel like.
Yeah, no, we totally agree. As much as I will defend Trae Young and like talk about how he actually is efficient, like his free throw drawing is something you can't ignore. Like it's a legitimate skill of his, and that boosts his efficiency. All these things you said it. He takes difficult shots, all that stuff. But he does take responsibility in the fact that I agree with you 100% that they need to do a little bit more, be more creative with him in general. That was one of the problems with him and DeJounte, is that it was very stagnant. Quinn's done a little bit more than the previous regime. Nate McMillan, God love him, veteran head coach, not an innovative
guy.
He's just not. So it is what it is. Yeah. But I do think that Trae also has to buy in. And I think he's matured a lot. I think he is more bought in than he was when he was younger at doing the little stuff. But he's got to do more of it. We're 100% on the same page there. And that's where I think some of the criticism has been fair of Trae, and that he is a guy who likes to play his own way. And a lot of that is not doing the stuff that you're talking about. Like the Steph thing, I think honestly is a big part of what poisoned the well with Trae Young and the discourse.
Yeah.
Is that they don't play. If you ever watch Trae Young,
they don't play nothing alike.
They don't play alike at all, and they never have. At the college level, by the way, they didn't play alike. Is that the only comparison was that they're smallish guys, and they take deep threes. That's it.
Yeah.
But that whole conversation has just seeped through and always has. So yeah, he's got to do more. The inverted thing is great. Is a great point. And look, they're gonna have no choice now. I think / hope, because without DeJounte, they don't have the prototypical number 2 shot creator. Maybe Jalen's gonna be that. But to this point, he hasn't been like the create for himself and others guy. He's flashing a little bit, all that. His usage has never been that high. So I think to get some, more system buckets, like more free flowing actions.
Yeah,
Trae's got to buy in to do that. But I think that's almost going to be out of necessity now without that clear like second ball handler short of Jalen.
Yeah, and like I like Jalen Johnson much because again, I think his game perfectly complements Trae Young. Athletic wing who can shoot. Right? If you can do all of those things and you are a pretty good connective passer as well, it really unlocks many different opportunities for the Hawks in the offense that they really want to go out there and start. I think that Trae Young has flaws, but I think every gifted offensive player has flaws. To me, it's more like, okay, I would say, right? It's more about the Hawks and Trae Young coming together to find different ways. Because again, if you want to become a number 1 player, these players find ways to impact the game in different levels. And Trae Young, I think, absolutely fits in that same, mold. It's unfortunate because in terms of the talent, he's never had like another good, consistent creator who doesn't need the ball. And I think Jalen Johnson has shown in some ways that he can grow into being that. I think in terms of the way he can attack closeouts, the way that he challenges the paint athletically, those are things that really trend well. And I always feel like the blueprint to building a championship team around Trae Young is you basically want to have a team of wings where Trae Young can basically create a ton of the offense and then have a secondary ball handler who can also create their own shot as well. And the Hawks have tried. They've definitely tried, but they've ran into so much bad luck. I mean, dude, I am a fan of my guy DeAndre Hunter, but he gets injured a lot, man. Like it's hard when these players are not available to play for you,
Yeah, like to your point, I was gonna say if you didn't like they did try that in the previous regime to do the Trae Young with big 2-way wing construction. They invested 2 lottery picks in Hunter and Cam Reddish. That was the whole plan with that duo, was to have them be the defenders, all this stuff. Cam kind of busted out, which is understand. Sometimes it happens. It's okay. DeAndre Hunter didn't bust, It's that he's kind of just been okay. Like he's okay. He does some things well.
Right.
He has some value for you, but he's not going to, I think year 6, we know what he is. He's not going to change your life. He is what he is. So yeah, I think that maybe they go back to that a little bit more this time around with this construction with Jalen, with Risache, who they just drafted and invested, of course, heavily in. But I do think that in general, the best, everybody wants this player. So it's not like a breaking news thing that I'm about to say, but the construction around Trae Young, kind of the best one, the ideal one, was always going to have a high-level two-way wing somewhere on your roster.
Always.
Like, obviously those guys are impossible to get, but they hopefully have one in Jalen Johnson as their hope. He's not like a pure wing. He's more of a combo forward, but the same thing stands. I think Jalen Johnson has star upside, and if that pops, he's kind of the guy that you would want next to Trae Young. He can defend on the wing, he can defend forwards, shoot a little bit, play make a little bit, and you need more than one of those guys, but now you have Risache and Johnson, and I think if you were trying to build a team, and look, Risache, we can talk about that if you want to. He's
down.
not the typical number 1 overall pick. He's not. I understand that.
Yeah.
So do they, by the way. They understand that. If you give him truth serum, they know he's not quite that number 1 overall pick guy that you normally would get, but he was the guy they liked the most, and he does have a projection of a archetype that everybody wants, of a 6'9" wing who can shoot and defend. That's what they hope he's going to be.
Yeah. I think Risache was so important because I got to say this, right? Coming in, my hot take of the Hawks was I thought that they might have blown everything up. I thought that Trae Young and DeJounte would be traded. When they didn't trade Trae Young, I said, okay, they're going to probably draft Alex. We got to see exactly how that fits. But to me, I think he's going to be a player that day one, his impact isn't going to be where it will be. I think he's going to take time to develop and project. I'm just wondering what that puts the Hawks timeline at, because I think a lot of people are confused by the Hawks because they're not sure if they're trying to go all in or if they're building up. It feels like a 2 timelines thing. And trust me, as a Warriors fan, I understand 2 timelines. Like it's hard to do that.
No, it is. And I tried to say that a little bit earlier too. Like, I think this year is an acknowledgement that they couldn't keep pushing in, but they also can't rebuild because they don't have their own pick.
Yes.
So it's like this, they're in this, I understand people's confusion because it's very hard to like explain from the outside. They're kind of in this in-between mold where they traded DeJounte for what I would describe as a future-facing package. It was Dyson Daniels, it's 2 first-round picks. That's a retool on the fly kind of move, but they still have Trae. They got some older guys. You got Bogdanovich and Capella, who are still really useful players. They're still trying to win now because there's no reason for them not to try to win now, if that makes sense.
Right.
But you're also hoping that first of all, you won the lottery when you probably shouldn't have. You got very lucky to win the lottery when you did.
Yeah.
Even if Risache isn't that huge prize, like he's a guy that would have been, if he was the 7th pick in the draft, you'd be thrilled. It's one of those things. So, honestly, it's 2 timelines, but it's also kind of one timeline of we're going to be patient, and it's hard. They don't fit into the box that most teams fit in right now. A year or 2 ago when they got DeJounte, they were clearly in win now mode. That was like their big move. We said it already, it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I think if they had their own picks, they might have gone totally into the tank. I'm not saying they were going to do that, but they would have considered it more. This time around, they didn't even think about that because there's no reason to do that. So they get lucky with Risache. They already have Jalen on the roster. They can kind of do both at the same time. And while that's not ideal, I promise you I understand it's not ideal. That's kind of where they are because they created so much for Murray that they just don't have that eject option that most teams have.
And that was my one thing about the trade when it happened, because I was very intrigued by it, because I'm like, okay, this is a chance for Trae Young to like prove that he can be portable next to another player that's ball dominant. But at the same time, if this experiment fails, 3 unprotected first-round picks for the Hawks means you cannot control your future. And, a team that's a living example of this to me has to be the Brooklyn Nets, a team that like did not control their destiny. And then they trade Kevin Durant, and then they trick the entire league into thinking they, genuinely want to build a team around McHale. Then they get all their picks back. Like not now, they're actively in control of their own destiny because of that. I think the Hawks are in a situation where they don't have their picks, but they still have a very good, talented player. They still have a player who can make their offense be a top, 10 offense. So because of that, you kind of just go with it, because Trae Young isn't 34 or 35. He's still very young as well. So you could say, we'll just take some more years to rework this thing as Trae Young gets a sharper game. Because every year there's lanes and avenues for Trae Young to develop consistently. And he's still a very efficient player. I'm just saying, in terms of what he could be, if he had a easier shot volume as well, he could be a much more impactful player. And he's already, I would say, one of the best passers in the league. I think he's probably the best lob passer in the NBA.
Yeah, the way I put it always with Trae is that I think he's the best passer who is short.
Agree.
Like you could say Luka's a better passer, you could say Jokic is a better passer, LeBron, those guys all have size that Trae Young cannot have. Like of guys who are point guard size, it's either Halliburton or Trae that are the best passers. If you want to say Halliburton, that's fine. It's fine with me. But he's that good. And I think that's a conversation that always gets lost about Trae Young. We don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but he's been top 3 in assists 5 years in a row, and it's just oh, he's okay. It's passing. No,
he literally averaged 30 and 10.
He's an elite passer. There's no way around it. It's always been honestly, that's his best skill. It doesn't get discussed that way, but his passing is his best skill, and it kind of always has been. Even when he was scoring 35 a game in Oklahoma, I get it, but his passing is what is actually truly elite. The rest of it is good. He's good at a lot of things, but his passing is his best skill.
Yeah, and I guess the reason why the Trae Young question is such a popular one is the introduction of the new CBA. This new CBA is one of the most restrictive things I've seen in watching basketball, where you're seeing teams overreact. You're seeing teams try to prepare themselves, because after this next season, we are officially under the, entire umbrella of that. And I think everything that the Hawks have done has been, in a sense, to not, be crippled underneath that. So to me, this makes it a bit harder to build out your team. However, this is where the importance of the draft comes in, because to me, the cheat code into being a good team now is to get players that can outplay their value on rookie contracts, right? I think Jalen Johnson could be a prime example of that, right? The value he gave you last year was clearly better than what his actual contract was. Getting players like that to add into your retooling could make sense for the Hawks.
Yeah, and the CBA affects everybody. I will always acknowledge that. It makes all these little things about how you have to match salaries closer and aprons and all. Anyway, what I think the Hawks are actually a little bit less impacted than some teams because of a self-inflicted thing. The Hawks do not pay the luxury tax, and they haven't for a long, long time. And maybe that'll change one day. I'm not saying it will never change, but we're at 3 or 4 years in a row of the Hawks actively sliding under the tax intentionally. Right. They don't want to pay the tax. And there's a whole conversation about that we don't have to have about what a franchise should be, what an owner should do for the city, all these things. But the results have been recently, they're just not interested in paying the tax. And that's one of the more limiting factors of the CBA is that it's punitive when you go super high into the beyond the second April, all those things. The Hawks aren't going to do that. But what it does do, and I think you said this early in this conversation, for a while, and most of this is the previous regime, they were paying everybody.
Yes.
Everyone they drafted that worked out, everyone they traded for that worked out, they pretty much kept everybody and they paid everybody. And you cannot do that anymore. You cannot pay them, especially the middle class guy. I don't mean that in a bad way. Like your 4th best player, 5th best player, who are good pieces for the future. You cannot
get a max. Yeah.
And you can't overpay. So I'm not trying to pile on again, I promise, with this guy who I know you like. DeAndre Hunter is overpaid by like $5 million. And it's not a totally terrible contract. It's not a disaster, but you can't have that contract anymore. You can't have a guy making $25 million who's like your 5th best player. It doesn't work, especially with what I just said. If you're not willing to pay the tax and not willing to have a huge bill, the only way you get away with a guy like Hunter making that kind of money is if you're willing to pay big money to kind of cover it up. You know what I mean? If you're the Clippers and you don't care about your money, you can pay everybody. That's fine. But if you're the Hawks and you have a self-inflicted cap of what you're going to spend, it's really hard to team build if you have a couple guys on your team like Capella and Hunter, who are useful players making $20+ million. Like, you can't have those guys anymore.
Yeah, no, it's 100% not viable. And I like Hunter in terms of the basic tools he can employ to be successful, but he is overpaid. And overpaying guys is a death sentence now in this overall economy. It's either you max a player or you trade the player, or you keep them and you somehow convince them to take less if they enter restricted free agency, right? Like those are your overall options. And I feel like the Hawks situation is so interesting because to me, this is really a make or break season, in my opinion, at least. Not for the Hawks as a team, but for Trae Young because of that extension that is coming up. If the Hawks want to fully commit to Trae Young being, I would say, under that, because then they would have to flirt with being a first apron team and seeing like where that overall journey might lead them to.
Yeah, this entire season is like, it's a learning year for the Hawks in so many different ways. Trae is definitely one of them. It's probably the most example. Like, I think in a year from now, the Hawks will either extend Trae or they will almost have to trade him.
Right.
You remember the conversation we all had about Donovan Mitchell going into the summer? Where it was like, either he signs the extension or the Cavs are going to have to trade him. And everybody kind of knew it. And he signed it, so he's staying. But like, it'll be the same thing with Trae Young, I think, in a year. Either he's going to be extended or they're going to have to trade him. Because you cannot let that guy get to free agency if you're Atlanta without getting anything back for him. That's the nightmare. So there's that one. There's this is a little bit lower stakes, but like Onyeka Okongwu, is he your center long term? Is like a big question this team has to answer this year. Like, they haven't given him the job yet. He was drafted 6th overall. They paid him, but they paid him pretty modestly on an extension, and he's never been the starter. Is he going to be your center? Because if he's not going to be your center, you got to find a center. Like, they have all these learning decisions that this year is going to be telling them so much. And Jalen too. If they don't extend Jalen, like, okay, is Jalen a max player, an auto max player, or is he like really good and there's a negotiation next summer? I don't know. We'll see. So there's always little things in the next year where we all kind of know the Hawks are not going to win 55 games this year and make the conference finals, but it's like, they're not going to be terrible, but they have so many questions that they just need more information to answer.
Yeah, and that's why this season is so fascinating, because there's more data to be learned about this Hawks team. Like, can Bogdanovich take another step this year, right? Where he played very well overseas, right? Like, seeing how that can translate back, even though I kind of feel like he just is who he is, where he can be a very viable and productive player, but I'm not sure if he's like a max guy either. Like, figuring out the roles and the situations on this team is something that I'm very curious to see, because again, when the Hawks are presented with that I would say ultimatum of maxing Trae Young or trading him, it then opens the question to, what do the Hawks want back for Trae Young? Because it's so weird, because for a player of his caliber, it seems as if a lot of teams aren't interested in giving high return back. And to me, it's like, he's a very good player. I think there's a couple teams that he makes a lot of sense with.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons. I think it got a little bit overblown. There's like a whole news cycle about this. I think Tim McMahon said it of ESPN on a podcast.
Yeah,
about how they had no market, and part of that is true. Like, one of the reasons why it was so easy for the Hawks to not trade Trae this summer, beyond the no reason to rebuild thing, is that they're like he's better right now than his standing in the league is. Does that make sense? I think his reputation is below where it should be, and if you turned around and said, all right, we're definitely going to trade Trae Young right now, you would not get appropriate value.
Right.
That was pretty clear this summer on the market. That's one of the reasons, not the only one, that they ended up trading DeJounte, because DeJounte was on a locked-in 4-year extension that was a good contract, because that was the one thing DeJounte did for the Hawks, was sign that extension. That was very favorable for Atlanta, that they were able to trade him and get value back for him. But one of the reasons is that Trae's market, like, they could have traded him and got some stuff. It's not like nobody wants Trae Young, but they would not have gotten the Godfather offer that you're envisioning when you're trading your franchise player for the last 5 years.
Yeah, and I can't be mad at them for not just doing any trade, because remember, we saw the Brooklyn Nets take time They convinced the world we want to build around Mikal Bridges, and they got 7 picks from the Knicks back for that. So to me, waiting it out with Trae probably makes the most sense. But while you're doing that, I'm really curious in terms of like what your biggest goals are for the internal development of players on this team. We mentioned Johnson a lot, but who are some other players that really interest you this season? Because this, season is about collecting data, but there are players who can make very key moments in their careers moving forward.
Yeah, I think Johnson's is a big one. I mentioned Okongwu. That's one that I have my eye on just because they invested in him with a lottery pick, but that was a different front office. And I think that we kind of know Okongwu is a pretty good NBA player. That's something we know. What we don't know is he going to be a starting center, like written in ink for you for the next 3 or 4 years? And they'd love to know that because they've been relying on Clint Capella for all this time, and justifiably so. He's been good for them. But Clint's about to expire. He's older. And if Okongwu's not the guy, they got to find a center. So that's one. And the other one that I would mention, Riche is obvious because they just invest, but that's just take your time and you drafted the guy, you love him, it is what it is. The other one is Dyson Daniels, who they get in the DeJounte trade. And yeah, you could argue the Lakers pick is like the biggest thing of the DeJounte trade, but the Hawks like Dyson Daniels, and so do I. I think people have forgotten that he was the lottery pick 2 years ago. He's like 21 years old. Like, he's younger than a lot of guys who were drafted this last year. His defense is already proven to be very, very, very good. Offense is a question. It is. But like, if you can find enough offense from Dyson Daniels, he's kind of a great partner for Trae Young. Obviously, it goes beyond that, but if you keep Trae Young long term, you're going to need someone to cover up for him, and I mean that in the nicest way, defensively. And Dyson is like exactly that. A guy with some point guard skills, was a point guard as a prospect. Not going to be a point guard in the NBA like a primary option, but like can dribble and pass, shooting's TBD. But like, they like Dyson a lot. So do I, honestly. And if he takes a step forward and becomes like a clear core piece for them, that would help a lot of different things. Like, not just with Trae, but for everything. Because I've said this a million times, but I'll say it here. Their biggest issue the last 2 years, you could say it's Trae and DeJounte, and that's not crazy. Their perimeter defense has just been dire for 3 years. And again, it's not just Trae Young. Is he part of that problem? Yes, for sure. But that has been their single biggest weakness on the court. And Dyson is just one player. He can't fix it by himself, but that's going to be a big one if they can kind of figure him out on offense.
So do you view Dyson as more so a combo guard that can play next to Trae Young, or more so a backup point guard for Trae Young?
I think a combo, and honestly, like they have Kobe Buffkin too. There's a guy that this regime drafted, this front office, this coaching staff, and they like him. He had kind of a lost rookie season because of injury, but they have a couple of these guys who are not like pure point guards. They had Buffkin play point guard in the G League exclusively last year for development reasons. I think Dyson is more of a combo, more leaning to the two, just because I don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to be like your primary run, pick and roll initiator. Like, he could do a little bit of that, but he's much more of an off-ball threat, I think, on offense right now. And I think if I had, again, we're talking pre-training camp. This is one of the big question marks of the team, is that I don't 100% know what they're going to do when Trae sits. I think it's going to probably be Kobe Buffkin as the first chance backup point guard, but it might be Dyson, and a lot of it's going to be Bogey, like, who's not a point guard, obviously, but they're going to run a lot through Bogey when Trae's on the bench, because they don't have the typical backup point guard like archetype. They actually try, and I reported this, they tried to get Tyus Jones when he was like clearly available for very cheap before he signed with Phoenix. Okay. And it was basically like, hey, we have to call Tyus Jones. He's too good to not call when he's about to sign for the minimum with Phoenix. Like, hey, Tyus, we'll give you $5 million to come to Atlanta. And Tyus justifiably decided the role was better in Phoenix for him, which made perfect sense. Obviously, in Atlanta, you're just Trae's backup. It is what it is. If you go to Phoenix, you might start on a good team. So I get why he did that. But they kind of know they don't have like that perfect caretaker backup point guard option. I think it's because Dyson's not exactly that. Kobe's still basically a rookie. So they like those guys a lot. It's just they don't really have like the initiator. That's at least a proven one behind Trae.
Yeah, I was going to say, I do feel like Bogdanovic's role a lot more this year is going to be to take advantage of the time where Trae's not on the floor. I'm wondering how much of that time he can share with Jalen Johnson, or would you rather see Johnson have his minutes directly, I would say, paired with Trae Young?
I think it'll be a combination. I think that they're going to have to try to figure out, because it seems so quaint now because it's a lot's happened in the last 2 years. But before they got DeJounte, like every single conversation I had was like, man, the Hawks are just brutal whenever Trae sits, and they had they couldn't figure it out. And I think one way to figure that out is to throw resources at it, which means play Bogey and Jalen are their second and third best players at this very moment. And it would make sense to have those guys on the court together when Trae's off the court. But to your point, you do want to see what Trae and Jalen looks like together, like for learning experiences. And that also opens up Jalen a lot too when Trae is initiating for him. So I think that if it's me, I'm probably just full on staggering Trae and Bogey. I would have Bogey on the court anytime Trae is not. And then not necessarily always with Jalen, but at least you got to give him Dyson. You got to give him someone else that can run some stuff alongside, because Bogey, as good as he is, and I think he's really, really good. He isn't like a guy that like is going to initiate for himself a ton at the NBA.
Right.
He can do a little bit of that, but like he's not going to be the guy who's like 30% usage on the ball. And they don't have a lot of. I mean, they got some ball movers. They got Buffkin, they got Dyson, they got Beat Krejci, who I liked a lot at the end of last season. Okongwu could play a little bit of like a scoring role maybe in those lineups, but they just don't have a ton of creation. So that's an argument for splitting up Trae and Jalen, is to have more of Jalen's creation with Trae on the bench. But I feel strongly that you don't want to separate them all the time, because Jalen kind of, not that he needs Trae, but I think that those two guys could ceiling raise together.
I agree.
Electric.
Yes. I believe the best version of Jalen Johnson paired with the shot quality from Trae Young in their two-man game can create really good offensive lineups. And I think you want to see as much of that as possible, because those are the types of experiences that are great for player development, especially because Trae understands exactly the right passes and pockets to find him.
Yeah. And to me, this is not a knock on Jalen, who I really, really like. He is unproven at this point as a primary scorer.
Right.
Like his half court offense, there were flashes for sure, but it's still a relative question mark. His transition game is amazing. He can go end to end. Like, he's scary with the ball in his hands on the move. But it's like, all right, what is Jalen's go-to going to be in the half court? Like, does he need to be set up, or can he actually be the guy setting up other people? That's a question that is going to have to be answered. And maybe like there's a developmental point that the Hawks might have where they intentionally kind of make Jalen the primary in some respect with Trae off the court, just to see what he's going to do with it, like as growth. Right. Not that it may not be the best thing to do that night for their offense, but just to see, all right, Jalen, you're our guy. Let's figure out what you're going to be long term, with or without Trae.
And that's why I am yelling, please get creative with Trae Young, because again, if you're using him as a guy where Jalen Johnson is operating in maybe DHOs with Trae Young, right? Like the lane that will create for him, right? Like Trae Young being used in those actions, I think will stop him from having to have so many possessions where he's literally creating everything, and just give him easier looks. But also it can open up the other aspects of even Jalen Johnson or Bogdanovich's off-ball games, right? Like there's so many different ways to get the most out of this core. And to me, this season for the Hawks isn't a tanking season, but it's also like a season meant for development, as you said. So getting the best of those moments, to me, should be a primary focus for this season.
Yeah, it really is a learning experience. And like, once the season starts, they're going to want to win games. Like Quinn Snyder's not going to come in there and they're going to want to win. Like this is a team that's not, it's weird because once the season starts, like they're going to, I hope there's an error of like, not every single minute of the season has to be win now, but they're also trying to win at the same time. Like, it's not like they're going to punt games. They're not going to do that. But I hope that it's more about learning than it is about, especially in October and November. Like, do you really have, like, good example is Reece Shea.
Right.
One of my go-to things that I believe strongly is that 99% of rookies are not good. And I don't mean that in a future-facing way. I mean in a present NBA sense. Most rookies are not going to help you win games. And Reece Shea may not help you win games, but you still need to play him because he's part of your future. It's like prioritize his development over playing a guy who may be better than him in October, but won't be in March.
I want you to know, as a Warriors fan, I can relate to that very sentence so heavily because I watched my team play Anthony Lamb and play Corey Joseph over Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody for 2 back-to-back seasons. Yep. And in my head, it's like, even if you think he provides more value, he didn't. But even if you believe that, if you know that these two guys have contract extensions that are coming up where they're going to go into restricted free agency and teams are going to throw offers at them, you have to know what you're getting from these players by giving them those reps. So that way, the next season can be their, okay, I'm ready to actually be a performative player who can really produce now, right? When you don't give them the field to mess up or learn how to play winning basketball, of course, they're not going to be playable players in a meaningful playoff series. Like, these things matter for the long term. Absolutely. I agree with that 1000%.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not defending that, but at least with the Warriors, you could argue that when you had Steph, like you were thinking you were a contender, so it was a little tiny bit more understandable. I'm on your side. I wouldn't have done it. I think Moody's been treated crazily. This is not a word.
Crazily.
Crazily. This Hawks team, nobody, even the team, they understand they're not winning anything this year. And when I say that, they're not making the conference finals. So they might. I think for me, it's maybe a playoff team if things go well, but they're not winning anything real this year. So like with that knowledge, you have to be even more proactive. And like your pick doesn't matter. Just learn. Like, you still want to win games every night. These guys are competitive, but there is no reason to prioritize. And I like I'm trying to use the extreme example. I like Garrison Matthews. He should not be playing minutes over Zach Ricochet.
No.
Even if I was trying to win one game today on September 28th, Matthews might be better than Ricochet. That's possible to win a game right now today, but it won't be in 2 months. So go ahead and play Ricochet. He's obviously more important to you long term. Same with Dyson Daniels. Like, these guys might be limited right now, but you're hoping they're part of your core long term.
And the earlier that you play these guys in the season, it gives them the confidence for March. It gives them the confidence for the last month of the season. And we all know that sometimes those moments in themselves translate to the second season or the third season. Like, moments like those are their first real sense of what it's like to actually be a trusted player in the NBA. So that's humongous for their confidence. Confidence is everything in the NBA. And if your situation is not giving you that opportunity to build that confidence, that could hurt your performance as a player to me.
Yeah, it's all about investing in the future. And it's a weird, I'll admit to you right now, it's a strange way to open a season when you cover a team. And it's not like the games don't matter, but like, I covered the Hawks rebuild. I covered before Trae got there. There were 3 or 4 years that I just knew these games don't matter. And that's different. That's different too. Like, there's some teams in the league right now that's like that. This is different than that, because like the Hawks are trying to win, but also there's a hint of these games don't matter as much as they would have mattered previously. So it's like, I'm juggling. I think it's an interesting challenge for Quinn Snyder, who like has gotten some criticism. I think maybe fair, that like he was supposed to be a difference maker in Atlanta, and he hasn't really been that so far. I think he's done a fine job. He's not done a bad job. But when they hired him, it was like, oh man, they're pushing. They got Quinn Snyder, and they haven't won. And usually, like I said earlier, head coach and star player get blamed when things don't go well. And like, but I think Quinn's pretty good, and I think he's a smart guy and a cerebral guy who like understands what's going on in Atlanta. And once the game starts, you're trying to win. But like, I think that there's a general direction that it's like not going to go crazy prioritizing the present over the future, which is what I would endorse.
Yeah, and I'm happy that you brought the head coach, because this is another part when it comes down to player development. If you keep moving on from head coach to head coach to head coach, you never can have a system in place for players to learn and feel comfortable with, because it's ever shifting. Like, I hope Quinn Snyder doesn't get fired in the coming 2 seasons. I think they need some time to just build it up. And I think to like rob him of that opportunity because you want to win a first round series is kind of short-sighted to me.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole dab on Snyder. I think that he has done fine. You could argue he's not been a huge value add, but certainly at no point have I been watching this team the last 2 years and thought they need to fire Quinn Snyder. Like, he's not the problem. There's a philosophy out there, and I think it's not crazy that people have that I trust. It's like, unless the head coach is a clear value add, you should move on and find one who is. I get that thinking, but I think Quinn Snyder has been a value add in the past, recently enough in Utah, and I think he's done a fine enough job in Atlanta that, like, maybe I'll change my mind in a year. Maybe this season will frustrate me or whatever. He'll do something crazy. But, like, I think right now he's definitely at minimum an average head coach. I think he's probably better than that still. So like, why wouldn't you keep the steady? It's a steady hand. I get it. He's got influence. Like, he's respected around the league. There's no reason to look to move on from him, because for me, last year was not at all Quinn Snyder's fault. It just wasn't.
No.
Like, it was a roster issue. It was a depth issue. And this is not the deep dive Hawks podcast where we talk about, like, how badly the roster was constructed beyond the top 6 last year, where they just cratered because they got 2 injuries in the front court and they just couldn't survive.
It was very
injuries.
rough. Yeah.
Like, you're playing guys who were not NBA level players, all due respect, and I won't even name them, but it wasn't their fault. It was that this roster just didn't make any sense at the forward line. They had 3 forwards on their roster that made sense. 3. You got to play 2 at a time. If you only have 3 on your roster, that ain't gonna work.
It's not gonna be enough to get it done. And like, that's why I'm saying for this Hawks team, it's interesting because I see some fans talking about the coach needing to be on the hot seat. But again, I'm looking at it like this roster isn't even sure of what it wants to fully do in terms of wanting to win a whole lot of games, or more so lean on the development of the players. So to me, like, there aren't real expectations on this Hawks team to have massive overall success. I think the red flag for this head coach would probably be if he's not trying to maximize young players, if he's just trying to play these vet players who are just going to add more wins because they're vets, but you're not actually emphasizing youth. That's a red flag for me. But if it's not that, I really fail to see how he could be such a bad coach to the point where he has to go. I just don't currently see that for this upcoming season.
Yeah, that was one of the things about Nate McMillan that drove me and others
crazy. Yes.
Yeah, because he was very open about it too. Like, he literally said the words, "We're not doing development anymore." That was a sentence he said into a microphone.
Wild.
And I know what he meant. He meant that they were trying to win games now, and look. It's just a bad quote. You can't say that out loud.
No, you can't.
But
because every team to some point is doing development.
Right, exactly.
At some type of level.
You're right. And Quinn's actually a big believer in development. The Hawks have done really well, like, integrating the G League team. Like, they actually care about this stuff.
Right.
But there is every head coach has this temptation, especially in the moment, to, like, all right, look down the bench and be like, I want to win tonight. I trust the older guy, the veteran guy, more than the young guy. That's always at least a somewhat of a threat. But I think there wasn't, like, a lot of egregiousness of that last year.
Yeah.
One reason, like, I guess maybe people thought about that was going to happen with AJ Griffin, but there was so much more going on there than there was that. So, like, once that became clear, there wasn't really another example of Quinn not prioritizing a young guy. Like, as soon as he got there, Jalen Johnson started playing a lot more. Like, literally, like, the day Quinn arrived.
Way more.
All right, Jalen's in the rotation. Here we go. So that's a good data point. I think Risa Shea, all indications that I have are he's going to play from day one. He may not start and play 35 minutes like most number 1 overall picks, because this team is better than most teams that have number 1 overall picks, and he's not as good as some of those guys. But he's going to play. He's going to play. He's not going to not play. So I'm not worried about that at all, really.
And, like, that really takes me to, I would say, this next point, right? Based off how confusing this team is, what are your baseline expectations for 2025? Like, what check marks do they have to hit for this to not be a failure of a season in your mind?
Yeah, I think, just to wrap it, I think it's a lot about what I've been talking about the whole time, which is, like, getting information that's key for your future. And if I had to pick right now, I think they're going to win more games than last year. Now, that's a relatively low bar to clear. They won 36 last year, and part of that, I'd say a big part of it, is that Trae had the first injury of his entire career, basically. He missed 28 games.
Yeah.
And that's why they won 36. Like, I'm not saying they would have probably won 40 if Trae didn't get hurt. Not that that's a huge gap, but it would have been more in line.
Right.
I think that they're going to be a high 30s, low 40s win team, 500-ish, something like that. but it's much more about the development and like the answers than it is about how many wins they have. Like they could win 35 games and have a good season.
Okay.
If things go according to plan. Like if Jalen takes a step forward, if they learn about a Kongwu, if Trae like if the vibes are good, that's a very broad statement in general. I'm doing that on purpose, but if the vibes are good for like what they've got with their core, Risache shows enough, Trae is comfortable and they like Trae and they're kind of gelling well together moving forward. Because there's still some roster challenges. Like if they have injury or two, like they could still be a pretty middling basketball team. But there's a way to do that with better vibes than there is a way to do that. And like they could also win 40 and have bad vibes. If they win 40 games because Bogey and Capella and Hunter drag them to 40 wins, like is that good? I don't know if that's good. Like it's much more about getting information and your young guys getting better and taking a step forward for me.
Yeah, and honestly, that's my same lens that I'm viewing this whole season through. I do still ask myself like about Trae Young because I personally think that he's been very disrespected in a lot of these talks, and I think that Trae Young acknowledges that his reputation is not where his real game lies, which makes me feel like this is going to be like a revenge season for Trae Young in a way, especially with like the ball being back in his hands more. I think he's going to have a very productive breakout year, which to me should also inflate his value back to being the proper reputation, which brings me to like my last real question, right? For you, in terms of knowing what this team is right now, what return for Trae Young would you deem to be a good return? Exactly.
I don't think I would be looking to trade him. That's my number one thing.
Word. Okay.
I think that, and it's funny because I've covered him his entire career, and I think if you asked a Hawks fan when Trae was a rookie or a second-year player, if I was too high or too low on Trae, they all would have said I was too low.
Oh, okay.
And I think now a lot of them would say I am too high. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
I think Trae Young is. I think I said this earlier. I think Trae Young is pretty much the same guy, and not in a bad way, like in a good way, that he was 3 years ago. And I think that's a top 25 player in the league. Like you don't trade those guys if you don't have to. But there's also a realization that could happen in the next year. It could happen by February. I mean, it could happen at some point where like the two sides kind of like shake hands and it's time to go. You know what I mean? Like, that's definitely possible. And I think for me, it's more about, it's not about what he is as a player. It's more about like, does he fit with what the Hawks want? And does he buy in? If he's not bought in, nothing else matters. Like that's the kind of the reality about the NBA is if your star is not bought in, he's either going to try to get somebody fired so he does buy in, or he's going to be gone. Like that's what the NBA is in a lot of ways for your best players. And if he's bought in, for me, I'm not trading him if I'm the Hawks. But he also has to buy in. And again, I said this earlier, but a year from now, if he won't sign an extension, you just have to think about trading him because he's only going to have 1 year left, and you cannot lose that guy for nothing. You just can't. How many times have we seen this in the NBA? You can't. A guy on that level, and you can debate which level that is, top 20, top 30, whatever you think about Trae Young. What you don't want to have is that guy leaving for nothing in free agency.
That's why the Knicks traded Randall.
Oh, that's why a lot of these things happen. Yeah, 100% right. I think Trae Young is better than Julius Randle, and
for sure.
And still, I mean, there's realities. I used the Mitchell example earlier on purpose. That's the one I think is the closest analog. Is that if Donovan had just wasn't feeling it, Cleveland, I would have said the same thing about that. And I think Donovan and Trae are somewhat similar in Spurs like stature. I'm sure people would have Donovan ahead of him right now. That's fine. That's a different conversation. But that's what I think. I think that for me, as long as he's bought in, I wouldn't be itching to trade him. But if you have to, you got to go. It's future facing at that point in time. You got to try to get picks. You got to try to get young players.
Yep.
Like what I don't think is the Hawks are going to turn around and trade Trae Young for a package to make them better in the moment. Those deals don't happen. Like how many times do you trade a star player and get better? Like that's just not what happens.
That rarely happens.
You have to start looking at the future if that happens. And look, you could argue that the Hawks should be on that timeline because they're at that point they're firmly building around Jalen and Risache and whoever else, and you got to get more guys on their timeline. But Trae's 26 years old. That's another reason why I wouldn't be itching to trade him. Is like he's not like far away from their timeline. He's still got 5 or 6 years of prime remaining in theory.
And literally,
like,
what 2 years in the NBA does, especially for like people have to remember, Jalen Johnson is basically just getting his feet wet now.
He was firmly on the edge of the rotation a year and a half ago.
Literally.
There were games a year and a half ago where he got DNP CDs.
Yeah. And my point about that is that speaks to what just one off season or even just one full year of player development can be. This Hawks team can go from this to in 2 years. Oh, wow. The vision makes a lot more sense. Oh, wow. Okongwu was our big man. Jalen Johnson is much better than we thought he could be. Bogdanovich actually took some, steps, or we made a trade for more, talent. Like things shift very rapidly in the NBA. So to give up on your star player just for the vibes and maybe try to get a high draft pick and I guess build around Jalen Johnson. I hate to say this. I'm from Detroit, by the way. You don't want to end up like the Pistons where it's just a bunch of high draft picks, but things don't pan out. And just every year you're just amongst the worst of the bottom feeders in the league. Like you want to build yourself up, I feel like.
Well, and one of the reasons, well, it's been a few years now, but one of the reasons why teams that don't want to rebuild is it's hard to get buy-in from ownership level to the community.
Yes.
Like the Hawks I should say just anymore. The Hawks did a full-on teardown for the first time in like 15 years that got them Trae Young. But it was tough, man. This is not a huge fan base compared to like the market size. Like all the jokes about Atlanta sports fans and how people overrun their building, all this. It's all kind of true on some level. I'm from here. I can say that. Nobody else is that, but I can. It's one of those things. And they have diehards like everybody else. They're great Hawks fans. But it's not traditionally been a big Hawks town. And there is some real risk if you try to bottom out again and you don't find that star and you get caught in Pistons land. And I still believe in Cade, but anyway,
Same.
if you get caught in Pistons land for 5-6 years and you're bad, the Hawks did it last time and it worked. It didn't work on like the super grand slam level, but they got their star player. But if you don't get a star player and you rebuild, man, that's what you don't want. And that's what I know Hawks ownership would not be very happy because suddenly, no one's coming to your games anymore, all those things. It starts to be a cycle.
And that's why it's not as like this is not a game where it's like, okay, we just lose, high draft pick. Oh, wow, he is a superstar. We win games, title. Like nothing is straight up linear, right? Like these things shift year by year by year. Addressing every year with a goal to hit is how you stay organized. And for me, that's why the learning process and the development of these players is so big now, because who knows what they can be 2 years from now based off of this foundational season.
Yeah, it's an intriguing time for the Hawks. It really is, to put a point on it. Like I understand why they're fast. To sickos like us, they're really interesting right now. You know what I mean? I think I find them. I cover them every day, so it's different. But I find them objectively interesting right now because they're not like a team that you put in a box. A lot of teams, like there are a handful of teams in the league right now that are obviously tanking / full-on teardown rebuild. That's an easy thing to kind of put in a box. Like it's not always easy, but you know what they're doing. There are a bunch of teams that are trying to win right now. Obviously, the Hawks are in that middle range where not a lot of teams are. And there's a reason for that. It's that they can't tear down, but it's they have fascinating kind of incentives, et cetera, et cetera. So I am interested to talk about them. Hopefully this is an interesting conversation, but I find them interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because I definitely classify myself as a basketball sicko because the teams I'm most interested in right now, the Hawks are up there. The Hornets, if LaMelo can actually play games, is another team that like really drives me crazy because it's like, okay, new head coach who seems very good with the principles of basketball. LaMelo is also a very good talent that doesn't have the reputation because the game is played, and also he hasn't really shown how healthy he can be for like a full season. And then even a team like the Raptors, who literally like traded all their good players who were there for the 2019 run, and now they're just completely rebuilding a whole new culture. Just seeing how that pans out, I pay attention to these things because, again, the league changes at the drop of a hat so fast. Literally 4 days ago, I was saying, okay, the Wolves, I'm comfortable, top 4 team. They went to the conference finals, year 3 of Gobert, Anthony Edwards. If they run some more pick and roll 2-man games with Cat, to have Anthony Edwards one pass away to keep Gobert in the action because they had so much success when they did that. Cool. Now they trade Karl-Anthony Towns. Now it's like, oh, damn. Well, if they did that, what if Gobert gets traded? Are they going to bottom out? Like, these questions pop up so fast. So just seeing where the teams are going, especially with the Hawks, is something that, every offseason really intrigues me. It's why I do this project, because our off seasons are never quiet. Something crazy happens every offseason, literally.
Yeah, or even in like late September, like we started talking about Towns, like that example is a perfect one where like that seemed fairly stable. Like those are two teams that seemed like they were in pretty stable places.
Yeah.
The Knicks already made big moves. They're obviously all in trying to win now. The Wolves made the conference finals and like have a pretty established team, and they still found a way to make a blockbuster trade on September 27th.
This was the best roster for Julius Randle too. And they just, nah.
And now he has to play with Rudy and an on-ball guy like Ant, and that'll be interesting.
God!
Not a ton of. I guess they got DiVincenzo. That'll help this. I was going to say not a ton of shooting in Minnesota other than Dante. So hopefully he stays healthy because they're going to need him.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching a lot of these games. But Brad, really appreciate having you on. This is the first time that we met, but I watch a ton of basketball. I love to communicate with people who do that as well. So I really appreciate your expertise on the Atlanta Hawks. Feel free to tell the people where they can find you.
Yeah, this was fun. I appreciate you having me on the show. We should do it again at some point in time.
I'm down. Super down in the season for sure.
Let's do it. My main thing is on the NBA side is covering the Hawks anyway, is the Locked On Hawks podcast, which is approximately 5 days a week during the season, audio platforms and YouTube. It never stops. We still do 3 or 4 a week in the offseason, which is crazy, but I'm a sicko, so it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the Hawks, I write about the NBA at Dime on Uprocks. I do some NBA draft stuff for them, college basketball stuff for them, NBA stuff for them. That's the main place. But podcast-wise, Locked On Hawks, and also have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/BT Rowland for my non-podcast Hawks content.
Absolutely. All of his links will be in the description box below. I got to say, I love this project I'm doing because this is extremely hard. Like, you go through all 30 teams. I have notes about players, vision, cap space, CBA, on, off, true shooting, effective field goal. Like, I look at so many things, and to summarize it all up cleanly, I really appreciate you for doing that today on this podcast. But all of his links and all that will be in the description. Make sure to follow Brad. This was a great podcast conversation, and we got more coming. I still have, I think, maybe 12 teams to cover before the season starts. So I'm going to be ramping up the content as we hit all of these thresholds for the 2025 NBA season. If you made it this far, appreciate you. Tap in on the YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts at Gifted Hoops, and go to the YouTube side for the video version with our lovely faces. But have a good one, people. Peace out. Watch basketball. We're almost there. Stay locked in. Peace.